Mr. Anderson, welcome. Feel free to jump in. I was just about to engage Lazarus on something, but it's something that you're more than aware of. And something that Mr. Anderson has tried and failed to address, but we'll see if he can address it this time. Anderson, we're getting the party started. So get those.
It's something I've tried and failed to address. I'm interested in that. Well, I mean, do you want to do our little discussion first, Donnie, and then we can get into Lazarus, or do you want to do Lazarus first?
I don't even know what he's going to get me on here.
Well, I was just wondering if Lazarus, because I know you're of the old Earth persuasion, but are you also of the evolution persuasion, in the sense that do you believe humans and chimpanzees go back to a common ancestor?
Well, evolution-wise, scientific-wise, yes. I think I agree with it, but at the same time, when I'm how do I explain this? So right now, like, I think evolution is the best explanation scientifically that we have, but I also would say this, though. I would say back in the day when, like, the 90s, when you and I were growing up, like, we were learning about black holes, right? And we thought it was, like, basically a tornado in the, we thought it was like that, sort of.
But I'm just going to run and get my charger. I'll be right back.
But then we started to learn more, and we were like, oh.
Well, Lazarus, let me just, I don't want to go too off the point. Okay, so you believe it's the best explanation, but I was pressing Charlie and Andrew and just about every evolutionist that I've engaged on just one of the many points that I believe an evolutionary model can explain. And so I'm not going to rehash everything. I'm not sure if you're listening, but if you do believe that humans, so if you believe humans and chimpanzees are related, go back to a common ancestor, then how do you explain the fact that, and we can see on the visual here, the human Y, here's the human Y, here's the chimpanzee Y. The human Y and the chimpanzee Y are only 35% the same when you consider overall gene content, overall size differences, and overall genomic architecture. It makes sense from the separate ancestry standpoint that, we don't need to explain these massive differences because they're not related. That's what the data seems to tell us. But if you're going to say that humans and chimps are related, how do you explain this huge discrepancy, Lazarus, my brother?
Well, I'd also say that Adam and Eve were created in sacred space. So that's what I would say with that. I would say God created Adam and Eve on a mountain that was in sacred space.
I'm not really sure I understand your. So are you saying humans and chimps are related or not?
Well, I'm saying that we have some similarities, yes.
But a lot of differences. So if you're going to say they're related,
there's a lot of differences,
you're going to have to explain how those differences arose.
Well, like I said, I think it's the best. I was trying to explain it earlier. Like, I think it's the best scientific explanation that we have. I don't think that it's necessarily that it's in the future we might find that it's not.
Well, I already showed you that it's not. I'm showing you this data point from the Y chromosome that suggests.
Yeah, but Donnie, you got to give them the context of the paper that's drawn from.
No, Mr. Anderson, the context of the paper provides what's called untested hypotheses: sperm competition, faster rates of gene conversion, faster mutation rates. They don't work. They're untested.
They're tested, right? They just.
Oh, they are. Then how come it says right here needs to be evaluated in subsequent studies? It's a hypothesis.
That's kind of the nature of science, right? Because you always leave a little bit on the table. You always leave them wanting more, and scientific conclusions are always tentative and are never firm, right?
Yeah.
So that theory can be like fleshed out some more. But look, I don't want to intrude into the conversation, but
it's okay.
There is a hypothesis. Let's just make sure that your interlocutor there is made aware of that. That there is the
interlocutor needs to be aware of data points that contradicts what he says and has been saying is the so-called best explanation for ancestry. So, Mr. Anderson, my question for you is, can you provide me a detailed mathematical model that outlines all of the massive chromosomal rearrangements, the changes in gene content, and the addition of entirely new gene families in 6 million years? Can you show me that mathematical model, Mr. Anderson?
I don't have something on my fingertips. What does the paper say?
Well, here's the thing. I've been asking. No, it doesn't provide that. I've been asking this argument.
Well, then look, if the
aware.
paper doesn't have one, then one hasn't been created yet.
Exactly.
Right?
So it's not science. So you have failed.
Look,
you failed in the past, and you failed now. Just admit it. Own it. Own it, Mr. Anderson. You don't have a mathematical model addressing this problem. It remains a problem.
You're right.
Actually,
hey, look, Donny, when you're right, I don't beat around the bush when it comes to things like that. I'm just saying that there is a hypothesis, at least, with respect to this. So there's competing hypotheses.
If I could real quick, evolutionists actually do have a mathematical model that explains why this is a problem. That mathematical model is that common ancestry is calculated, the chronological distance between humans and chimps is calculated to the tune of 1e - 6. So they've already assigned a mutation rate, and it does not match the Y chromosome difference.
Yeah, it's true. It doesn't match the Y chromosome difference, and that's why there's a separate, I guess you would call it a rescue device, but I would just say that there's a separate explanation with respect to the Y chromosome that's got a lot more to do with the way that chimps are than the way that humans are.
Are you confident, Mr. Anderson, my good man? And always great to have you, by the way. Are you confident?
No, it's a pleasure.
Is sperm competition enough for you to believe that the chimpanzee Y right here, the reason why this chimpanzee Y is essentially nothing like the human Y is because of sperm competition? Are you satisfied with that answer?
You know what? I'm not going to go out on a limb and say that that I know enough about it to get into a real drag 'em out fight with you on that one, Donny. If you want, I can prepare for that. But that's not what I'm prepared for tonight.
That's fair. That's fair.
You know.
Thank you for the engagement, Doc. Mr. Anderson, start to you, my good man.
Thank you so much, Donny. So, as just a backdrop from our to our conversation, can we agree that we're under the October 13th protocol?
As far as I can remember what the October 13th protocol is.
I'll rattle it off for you. You tell me if there's anything wrong.
No, let's just go right to it. Let's just go right to the mitochondrial DNA. If you want, I can kick us off because we're at the 3-hour mark. You know.
All right. Let's. And the other thing I wanted to make sure. So I'm going to assume that we agree on the reality of reality. Then, if there's something that fusses you about that, then I guess we can go over it. The other thing I want to make sure we agree on is that we both agree that natural selection is a thing and that it does operate on humans. I'm not asking you to agree that macro evolution or anything, just acknowledge that natural selection exists, that it is a force, even if a small one. You agree with that?
I agree that natural selection being differential reproduction, yes, it's acting. It's not. It's limited for sure. You know, it's mostly good at removing the worst mutants from the equation and amplifying your rare beneficial mutation, but it's almost non-existent when it comes to most mutations, nearly neutral mutations. It doesn't see those. So those are, so it's definitely there. It's real. But
that's all limited. I wanted. Now, when you're looking at identifying the literal Eve, you're using the molecular clock, right?
Yeah, we're looking at mitochondrial DNA diversity in combination with the observed mutation rate.
Okay. And the molecular clock is based on the accumulation of changes within the genome as a whole over successive generations, right?
Well, yeah, if we're looking at the pedigree rate, right, you can look at grandmother,
not necessarily
mother,
looking at the pedigree rate. We're looking at the molecular clock in general. The molecular clock is the accumulation of changes within the genome as a whole over successive generations, right?
You can take grandmothers, mothers, daughters.
It's not the question I asked you, Donny.
Well, I'm going to answer the question however I want to. You can take the differences, you can count them up, and what you typically come up with is a fast mutation rate. But we're not, as creationists, we're not necessarily concerned and this is where I should ask you, have you read the Eve consensus sequence paper yet by Dr. Rob Carter in the conventional
I flipped through it.
You flipped through it or read it?
Flipped through it.
Do you remember what the average nucleotide difference was between any person between the Eve consensus sequence? Because that's an important point if we're going to discuss this.
The one that I was looking at more closely was actually the paper that he based his stuff on, which is the Ding et al. Paper. And we'll get into that in a minute here.
Yeah, but that one was published in a Creationist. I'm talking about the conventional literature.
The Ding et al. Paper is a conventional literature.
No, I'm talking about the paper that Dr. Rob Carter published in the conventional literature. Do you remember the name of that one, Mr. Anderson?
No, I'm not going to remember the name of any paper, Donny. I don't have a good memory for that sort of thing.
Do you remember our last discussion that Dr. Rob Carter published the Eve consensus sequence?
Just tell me the answer. Just tell me the answer. What's the number that you want?
So
I'm not worried about Dr. Rob Carter's number. I'm worried about Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson's number.
Well, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson has a slightly different approach than I do.
Do you agree with Jeanson's approach? Or do you think that there's a problem with Jeanson's approach?
Jeanson has his own predictions based on his own model. And since my approach to it is different, I would make different predictions based on the mitochondrial DNA. For example, I'm not necessarily concerned with species-wide change, how quickly or how slowly the entire species changes as a whole. I'm more concerned with divergence from the Eve consensus sequence that was published by Dr. Rob Carter in the conventional literature, which is what I'm trying to find here. And on average, it's about 21 mutations different.
Right. I remember that's the average. Yeah. And it's about 140 is a maximum. You have to use the maximum. Right. We had that conversation before. So it doesn't matter what the average is, because what we care about is what is the most different that we have been, because that's the amount that we have to accumulate over that period of time. Right.
So the question is, how quickly or how slowly do humans diverge from that Eve consensus sequence, in the sense how long does it take?
When you're doing that, when you're looking at how quickly or how slowly those two diverge, you're looking at the changes within the genome as a whole over successive generations, right?
Just keep making your case. I want to find the paper. I got a lot of slides.
No, I want to nail this one down. Let me put it another way. Let's see if you'll agree with this, because I think you're hesitant to agree with that statement. Would you agree with this? Would you agree that by looking at how far apart, you take two groups, you look at how far apart each group has drifted, and based on that, we can determine how long it has been since their genes were mixed, which is to say, how long has it been since they had an ancestor in common for that gene? And in this case, that gene that we're looking at is the mitochondrial genes, right?
Not necessarily, because how long does it take to accumulate 140 differences from the Eve consensus sequence? And so we know the mutation rate is fast. And so we know that
Donny, I'm just going to ask you to stop flipping through your slides for a second and listen to what I'm saying, because what I'm saying is the same thing as what I think you're trying to say, but you're not listening to me because you're trying to find something else. Just listen to what I'm saying.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, there's two groups. You're still flipping. I can see you doing it. There's two groups. In order to determine how far apart they've drifted using the molecular clock, what you're going to do is you're going to look at how different their respective genomes are, the two groups' genomes. And that will allow you to determine how long it's been since their genes had been mixed together. And what that in turn means is how long it has been since they had an ancestor in common for example, the mitochondrial DNA. That's true, isn't it?
I think that's a mathematical blunder.
It's difficult because if you look at this mitochondrial,
that's what mitochondrial.
Anderson, I've given you so much uninterrupted time to speak.
Sorry.
You've literally spoken more than me. Relax, okay?
Go ahead.
So if you look at the mitochondrial DNA phylogenetic tree, that's I think there's some built-in assumptions, because let's take the HVR haplogroup, right? These are a reflection of DNA differences in people groups over time. These branches all go back to a common ancestor.
Mm-hmm.
But the branches are different sizes. So we have differing size branches, which means the mutation rate is variable. It's not constant, because this tells us that people are picking up more mutations in the same amount of time than their cousins. And so it's not that easy to take two different people groups, count up the differences, and try and figure out when those people groups split from a common ancestor. Let's say if we were to look at, a certain island, or when a population founded a certain part of the globe. Go ahead.
So I put it to you that when we are using the molecular clock, the presumption that we make is that rate at which those differences accumulate is constant, and that's how we count back in time.
No,
and that rate.
I don't agree that it's constant, and that's where I would differ from Dr. Jeepson. Is I believe the mutation rate is not constant, and you can see that reflected anyways, because you have people in the same amount of time picking up more mutations than their cousin, and we know hypermutation is a reality. There's a paper here in 2022 that talks about how two known families had genetic drivers of germline hypermutation. So it comes down to this.
Right. Those guys were exposed to radiation, though.
Right. Oh, right. Exactly. We talk about the heat problem. Immediately post-flood, those rocks are going to have a lot of radiation in them. They're going to have a lot.
Those guys, that guy was undergoing they were like nuking his testicles, I think. But at any rate, no, it was chemotherapy. I think he was doing chemotherapy, something like that. Doesn't matter.
So
my point here is, look, no, T-Rock, just, you know what? You're going to get a chance if I don't want to take on two people at the same time.
I want to make this point so it's clear to the audience. Okay.
Go
ahead. Mutation rates are variable. Okay. The consensus sequence paper, you have to look it up yourself. They've got a consensus for Eve. They know what Eve's sequence look like in terms of the mitochondrial DNA. We know on average it's between 20 and 25 DNA differences separating any two people from each other, or the Eve consensus sequence max is about 140. So how long does it take? Rather than looking to species-wide change or the substitution rate, how quickly does a species change? We're more concerned with how long does it take to accumulate the max amount of DNA differences. 140 in light of a per generation mutation rate of about 0.1 to 0.5 in the mitochondrial DNA.
Well, but you can't say that, Johnny, because you just told me the mutation rate's highly variable. So which is it? Is it highly variable, or is it relatively consistent? If it's relatively consistent, then you can count back and you can get your 6,000 years. If it's highly variable, then you know what? Maybe Eve was a bajillion years ago, and the mutation rate was really slow for a period of time. But I don't think that's the argument you want to make.
It sounds like it's consistently fast, but
so it's consistent.
Some lineages will mutate even faster in the sense that they'll accumulate more differences based on.
I'm not trying to bust you on. I know that you want to say that Africans are faster, and I know that you want to say that Neanderthals are faster. You know what? I don't agree with you, but we're not even going to talk about that right now. Let's just talk about, except for those, okay? And if you got other examples, say except for those two. Except for those, the mutation rate is consistent, right?
It's still difficult because, again, this is the HVR haplogroup, most common in Europe. And you can see that even amongst them, which are not Africans, it's not Neanderthals, not Denisovans, the mutation rate's variable. And so it essentially breaks
those
evolution.
The
beginnings of your sentences are starting in the middle of mine. It means that you can't make those evolutionary assumptions based on the evolutionary molecular clock. All we can do is look at the Eve consensus sequence. We know how many mutations removed we are from Eve, okay? Does it take 200,000 years or 100,000 years to accumulate those DNA differences, or does it just take a couple hundred generations? And I would say the most parsimonious explanation is that we're looking at only a couple hundred generations worth of mutations on this phylogenetic tree. Go ahead.
Right. But see, so what it seems to me that you're saying is, not only do you think that the pedigree rate is the rate to use. See, what the conversation I wanted to have with you is whether or not we should be using the substitution rate or the pedigree rate. But it seems to me that you're saying not only do we need to use the pedigree rate, in fact, that rate is useless, and we can't tell a darn thing about when. Like the molecular clock is not a thing. That's what you're arguing with me right now. Do you think that the molecular clock is a thing? Answer me that.
I don't think it's that there's a strict molecular clock.
Do you think there's a molecular clock at all?
Well,
is it a useful concept?
I think we can point to a rate that is consistently fast and yet variable. And I think that consistently fast rate, in light of the fact that
it can't be variable and consistent. It has to pick. You got to pick one. So, do you believe in the molecular clock? Do you believe in its ability to? Do you believe in its ability to allow us to estimate how long or how many generations removed one population is from another, or do you think that it's got no use at all?
No, I think there's a use. We'd have to look at a case-by-case basis, though.
A case-by-case basis. So there's no consistent use for the molecular clock. What you're telling me is you don't believe in the molecular clock.
I don't believe in the evolutionary molecular clock that has to assume.
It doesn't sound like you believe in any molecular clock. Do you believe in any molecular clock?
Well, I believe we can make conclusions based on the accumulation rate. Okay.
Well, how can we make conclusions based on the accumulation rate if we don't have an accumulation rate that you think is consistent? See, what the problem is, Donny, you're kind of cornered here in that you're going to have to either say, I don't believe in the molecular clock, or you're going to have to admit that you believe that there is a consistent rate. You can say it has a little bit of variation here and there, but if we're going to say that there is a rate at which humans accumulate mutations on a per generation basis, that rate is going to have to be something that you're going to have to say is consistent. Otherwise, the molecular clock is utterly useless, and you just don't believe in the molecular clock, which is fine. Which way do you want to go?
I believe it's consistent enough to say that there's only a couple hundred generations on any given mitochondrial DNA phylogenetic tree. Now, when we look to certain groups, we understand that there are factors.
I know about the Africans and the Denosovans and I mean, I don't agree with you on any of those.
Again,
but I don't want to talk about that. I just want to talk about the regular rate.
I, for sake of argument, I will say, even though, like, let's just say the HVR haplogroup, even though the rate is variable, it's not variable enough to where we can't look at a per generation rate and understand that per generation rate or accumulation rate takes us back to, let's say in this case, an Eve about 6,000 years ago.
Right.
Less than 10,000.
So we can calculate Eve. You believe that we can calculate how long ago Eve was because we have a molecular clock, and that molecular clock accumulates variations at a consistent enough rate to be useful, right?
To be useful enough to say, hey, the on average DNA differences being 20 to 25 is
to be useful enough to calculate the age or the difference in number of generations. I'm not concerned
with species wide. I'm not concerned with substitution. I'm not concerned with how quickly the entire human. I'm not done talking. I'm not concerned with how quickly the entire human species changes as a whole. I am concerned with how long. Okay, we can reason together. How long would it take to accumulate roughly 25 DNA differences from the Eve consensus sequence that you would argue is a coalesce sequence? I would argue it's Eve's real created sequence.
That's the same thing. Eve's real created sequence would also be a coalescent sequence, right?
Right, but you would say that at one point each DNA position there, each allele was a wild type allele that drifted to fixation.
What I would say is
that there was no previous ancestors to that sequence, the Eve consensus sequence. It's the created sequence. There's no prior ancestors to it.
That doesn't matter to me.
Okay.
So, not for this conversation, it doesn't. So, if a change, so we're talking about how far, when we're looking at let's say, for example, an island population, do you agree with me that you can figure out how long a population has been isolated from another population using the using the molecular clock? So, for example, on this tree that you've got, this phylogenetic tree, we can say, look, this molecular clock is going to show that the European group split off from the Asian group about X number of generations ago. And all of these variations that form part of the European clade, those separated from all of these variations that form part of the Asian clade, and that happened X number of generations ago, and the biological clock can tell us that. Do you agree with that?
No, not necessarily, because I do agree that a phylogenetic tree like this is a reflection of the last 4,500 years of human history. For example, I do believe all these branches go back to a common ancestors about 4,500 years ago. And so post-flood history would be reflected on this tree. But to say exactly when populations branched off, to say when certain groups settled, the origin of groups on certain islands like the Canary Islands, I do believe there's going to be some assumptions at play that we're going to have to work through. Assumptions on population sizes, when they are, if there were replacement groups there. So
okay, well, we're not talking about the Canary Islands yet. We're talking about Europeans and Asians. And according to Dr. Jensen, who I understood you agreed with, Dr. Jensen would say that he can count back and look at the number of mutations between the common ancestor of all Europeans and the common ancestor of all Asians, and say that those two had their own common ancestor, 14 generations further back. He would say that I can count these back, or however many, back. That's the molecular clock.
He's looking at the Y chromosome in traced, if I remember correctly, and he's looking.
Doesn't matter. But you can do the same thing with mitochondrial DNA, though, right?
But he's made predictions on mitochondrial DNA, but he's tested the predictions on Y chromosome, and he's looking at population growth curves.
All right. Well, I misspoke then. In replacing Darwin, then he uses mitochondrial DNA.
Right. In replacing
this is the one
Darwin,
with mitochondrial Eve. So with mitochondrial Eve, he can go back and he can say, look, the molecular clock is going to accumulate changes at a particular rate, and that means that if we look at the number of changes between all of the population, between this clade, which is the spreading out clade of Europeans, and this clade, which is the spreading out clade of South Americans, that means they had a common ancestor X number of generations ago, right?
This is
Come on, Donny. This is basic stuff. You can dodge when we get to the tough stuff. Let's get through the basics.
This is a tree from Dr. Jensen, and he has all branches going back to 3 major haplogroups. This is an unrooted tree, L, M, and N. And so he argues those are possibly the 3 daughters-in-law of Noah. So Shem, Ham, and Japheth's wives. The lines, I'll ask you this, Mr. Anderson. According to Jensen's model, these lines connecting the 3 major haplogroups, L, M, and N, what do they represent?
Well, I mean, look, you're answering a question with a question. You didn't answer.
Hey, listen, you asked me about 10 questions. Answer my question. Don't dodge. Dive and dodge. Mister, you're better than this, mister. I know you're excited.
Okay. You know what? All right. Here, I'll trade you. So you asked me your question, but then you got to promise you'll answer mine, and I'm going to keep asking mine until you answer.
I'm going to reiterate the question, okay?
All right. We'll do yours first, just because I love you so much.
You're an expert at Dr. Jensen's model. I know you're excited. Relax. Okay. Since you're an
Yeah,
expert,
relax, I'm chill. Go ahead.
Since you're an expert at Dr. Jensen's model, my very basic question again. According to Dr. Jensen, you have L, M, and N. These short lines connecting the three major haplogroups. How does he view that?
He considers those to be the three daughters, or sorry, the three wives of Noah's three sons.
The points.
He considers those to be sisters, I believe.
Yes. Well, I literally just said that, but I'm talking about the lines connecting them.
All right. What about him?
It's his model. It's a basic point. What does he say those lines are? What do they represent?
Well, he says that they represent relationships. I mean, I can tell you what conventional science says they represent, or I can tell you what they say. He says they represent. He says that they are that they're sisters, I believe. Isn't that correct?
Well, he said two could be sisters and one is not, but that's besides the point.
Sure.
Well, okay.
So what's the question?
I'll ask this question. What is
he get one more, and then we're going to go back to mine.
No. We're not playing that game. Okay. I'm too experienced. Mr. Anderson. Mr. Anderson,
we should
answer this basic question, because what this is, it is destroying your credibility on your line. Because
no, go ahead. You answer you ask your question. I'll answer it.
For the last 3 days, you don't know a basic point of Dr. Jensen's model, who you're trying to utilize to argue against me. So I'll ask you this question, since you failed the first question.
I don't think I failed it, but go ahead.
Okay, well then I'll ask you again. These lines connecting L, M, and N, the three major haplogroups, what are those lines representing according to Dr. Jensen's model?
So it's an unrooted tree. So they represent relationships. They could be familiar. Like, I mean,
well, they represent DNA differences, mutation.
Yeah, that's right. They do represent DNA differences. Yeah, and the branch length is going to represent the number of differences. What's your point?
Are those DNA differences post-flood or pre-flood?
They would likely be post-flood.
No, see, this is a very basic point that the critics of Dr. Jensen
sorry,
made.
are you saying that the which direction are they going, right? So are you saying like the connections between the three wives? Well, the three wives were alive before the flood, right? But all the lines, that lead to all the other people on the tree, those necessarily are after the flood.
Right. So these three lines connecting the three major haplogroups would represent pre-flood mutations. That's why they're shorter. Okay. Less mutations accumulated, shorter period of time, makes sense.
Yeah.
The lines radiating out from these three major haplogroups represent post-flood history. And so the lines radiating out.
Well, I don't think that's necessarily true, but sure.
We're steel manning his model. I understand you don't agree, but if
you're going, you tell me what you want. Will you tell me what you want the model to show me? And if you have a point to make, then go ahead and make it, and then we'll get back on task here.
So the point is, this phylogenetic tree, which just represents worldwide mitochondrial DNA variation, we have three major haplogroups. The lines radiating out, representing DNA differences, according to Jensen's model, is post-flood history. And so he predicts that we should be able to read, as you've put, the history of civilization off of this mitochondrial DNA tree. But he did not test this prediction yet. That's what he said in Replacing Darwin. What he actually went with in traced was the Y chromosome. And he read the history of civilization from the Y chromosome, though, using population growth and matching it to the mutation rate.
Okay. You done?
That's it. I mean, if you're going to criticize his model.
So here's where, so let's get back on track.
Are we talking Y chromosome or mitochondrial DNA?
We're talking mitochondria.
Okay.
Talking mitochondria, always have been. So I want to talk about, so you'll agree with me then that when we look at that graph, you can tell by the branch length, the distance between the different nodes, you can tell how far it has been since, or how many differences have accumulated between the various nodes, right?
No, I think it's too variable. He hasn't tested it. He made the prediction.
No, dude, that's how the chart is written. You're the one who's quizzing me about this stuff like 2 seconds ago. That's how this chart's drawn. The length of the line is the number of mutations,
Right.
and then the number of splits is the number of variants. That's how it works. Isn't that true?
Right, but I'm saying there's so many assumptions going into this that
those are just
you're going to have to address the amount of DNA differences that have accumulated since the consensus sequence. So what you're saying, you can look to an island.
What you're trying to do right now is just sort of grind this conversation to a halt so that you don't get cornered here. But I mean, we can go around and around and around on this until kingdom come if you want. I don't mind, but you're going to get tired.
For sake of, I'm not cornered, because even for sake of
argument,
even for sake of argument, if I were to say you got a strict molecular clock, here's the mutation rate, it's 0.1 or 0.5 per generation. Okay.
Right.
If you want to take that back linearly, how long does it, how many generations does it take?
Let's assume those
let me
things
finish.
for the sake of argument.
For sake of argument, if you want to say that it's just this linear clock, okay, 0.5 per generation in the mitochondrial DNA, how long does it take to accumulate 140? Just a couple hundred generations. There you go.
Sure. So yeah, just take that position. Thank you. That's all I expected of you. So if a change doesn't accumulate in a successive generation, then it's not going to matter in terms of the molecular clock, though, right? Because it's not going to show up in the genomes of those people however many generations down the line.
Are you saying in a single generation mutation?
I'm saying that if let's say, I'll give you an example, right? If I get cancer of the pinky toe 10 years after my kids are born, that mutation won't accumulate in the subsequent generations, right?
If you get
it's not going to matter in terms of the pedigree rate. It's not going to matter in terms of the substitution rate, because that mutation in my pinky toe, it's going to stay in my pinky toe. It's not going to make its way into my kids because first of all, it's in my pinky toe, not my sperm. I know it's the basics, but just agree with me if you agree with the basics.
Yeah,
that's not going to get into the next generation, right?
Like your skin cells, they're not passed on, but your reproductive cells, your germ cell lines, those are the mutations that are passed on, right?
Right. It's only the germline cells that are gonna matter, right?
Right.
Okay. And so we have to realize then that not all of everyone's genes are going to make it down the line into the next generation too, right?
Right. Well, only the ones that are passed on through the germ cell line, right?
Well, so there's the ones that are in the germ cell line, but then also I have 2 kids, right? Not all of my genes are in those 2 kids, right? There's going to be a random mix of half my genes that are in one and a random mix of half my genes that are in another. And if we were to look at both of the genes that I passed on to my children and add them together, it's not going to add up to being all of my genome, right?
Right.
Okay. So luck and natural selection are also going to play a role, right?
Natural selection isn't going to play a role on the nearly neutral mutations. They're going to draft.
No, only on the ones that are selectable, but it will play effect.
The one's big enough,
yeah. All right. Now, if we I want to look at how Jensen calculated or looked when he did his pedigree mutation rate. He used a rate from a paper called Ding et al., right?
Right.
And that was a rate that was calculated between parent and offspring. So from mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited only from the mother, that was the number of differences between the mother and her child due to mutation. He used a study from 2015 that compared mitochondrial DNA from between parent and offspring that was extracted from their blood samples, right?
Right.
Okay. And blood, of course, is a somatic cell. It's a working part of the body rather than a germline cell, right?
Right.
Okay. So it's a cell it's not a cell that would be used to transmit genetic information to subsequent generations, right?
If it's a somatic cell,
it's a blood cell.
Right.
Okay. And somatic cells divide throughout the life of a person in order to maintain homeostasis, right?
Yes.
Okay. And as those cells divide, they're going to start to accumulate mutations of their own, aren't they?
Of course.
Okay. But that's not true of a woman's eggs, which she's actually born with, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you measure the differences between somatic cells in an adult and their offspring, a bunch of those changes are going to be changes associated with mutations that occurred during that person's lifetime that are not going to be passed on to the next generation, right?
Right.
Okay. In fact, they'll be from three sources. You're going to find mutations from three sources. One, germline mutations. Two, somatic mutations that occurred in the parent. Three, somatic mutations that occurred in the child, right?
Right.
And those differences from numbers 2 and 3 could in fact be significantly more than the amount of change that you're going to observe in the germline, right?
It could be a higher mutation. So the mutation rate that was derived from the Ding paper could be higher than it really is because of these factors.
Right. In fact, it could be significantly higher, right?
Of course, if it's counting somatic cell line mutations, then yeah.
Yeah. And the Ding 2015 study that Jensen used when he was calculating his Mitochondrial Eve pedigree mutation rate included all three of those things, didn't it?
Right. I debated Dr. Dan Stern Cardinal on the same topic 2.5 years ago.
Yeah.
You're not telling me anything I don't know.
All right. Well, I mean, here's the problem I have, though. If you were to factor out those other changes, the somatic changes, then you're not going to get a 6,000 year timeline, are you?
Well, if you're just basing it on that one study, have you looked at, the Parsons study?
Pick a study that does that. Pick a study that doesn't include the somatic mutations. And that number goes above 6,000 by a lot, right?
Are you familiar with the Parsons paper?
Nope. I am familiar with lots of other papers, and none of them say that 6,000 is the one. The only way that Ding gets you to 6,000 is because it includes a significant number of somatic mutations, right?
Here's the Parsons one. I don't look to the Ding one. So here's the Parsons paper.
So you don't use that pedigree mutation rate.
Right. Yeah, I agree. So the Parsons paper, TJ Parsons.
Yeah.
So this is Ann Gibbons. This is a commentary on the Parsons paper. And the Parsons paper talks about how the mutation rate, a lot faster than the phylogenetic rate, pointed to mitochondrial Eve 6,000 years ago. And the data was so good, the methodology was so good that this contributed to the development of mtDNA research in the FBI. So the FBI has actually adopted this rate or methodology in getting the rate. And it was fast, very fast.
Yeah, well, the FBI is going to use is not going to be using the phylogenetic rate either now, is it?
Right.
Right. It's going to use a pedigree mutation rate because they're caring about the fastest possible mutation rates because they're going to be discounting things like selection, right?
Right, exactly.
And the longer the span between parent and child, if you do 3 generations, it's slower. You do 6 generations, it's slower yet. You do 9 generations, the mutation rate is slower yet. Isn't that true?
Well, the Parsons paper used the pedigree rate and showed that it was very fast.
Yeah, for a very short period. I'm not familiar with the Parsons paper, but I bet you a nickel the Parsons paper uses a rate like 1 generation, 2 generations maybe. And if you were to do 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 9, then the rate slows down, and it slows down quite quickly. Isn't that true?
It would be right, but I think
have you looked at any other papers besides the Parsons paper?
He looked at he looked at a good amount of data. It wasn't just a one or two. I think it was a trio. So grandmother, mother, daughter.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was
So two
three
generations then, or two
but from my
steps.
understanding,
And if you do 6 or you do 9 or you do 12, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, doesn't it?
well, according to if evolution's true, your
not according to if evolution is true, just based on looking at these pedigree mutation rates. If you look at various pedigree mutation rates, the longer they go, the more generations they do, the longer or the slower the mutation rate, right? It slows down and down and down, doesn't it?
Well, but again.
So yes or no, Donny?
Well, no, because the neutral mutation rate, the neutral mutation rate that you would get, let's say you
this isn't about the neutral mutation rate, because we're not discounting selection. Selection is probably one of the biggest factors here after we've accounted for the somatic mutation rate, which was your first big problem.
It's the mutations that are
and selection is your second problem, because as selection comes in and as drift comes in, it eliminates more and more of those pedigree mutations, and fewer of them get into the subsequent generations as we go more generations down the road, and it slows right down. Isn't that true?
I wrote a technical article with Chris Roop on this. Have you read it?
I've read a number of your articles. I think I did. I think I have read that one, and I think that what I'm saying is still the case, and I'd like you to agree with me. You keep on changing the subject. Isn't it true that the more pedigrees or the more generations that you look at with a pedigree mutation rate, the slower that mutation rate?
No, because most mutations are lost, but many are not. And so in the evolutionary time scale, your neutral mutation rate, those mutations that are not subject to selection, it is going to equal or be close to equaling a fixation rate.
That's right.
This is called fixation equilibrium.
And what's another name for a fixation rate? It's called the substitution rate.
Exactly. So the substitution rate
has
is therefore by definition
and
high.
as it slows down, it approaches the substitution rate. But I'm not even forcing you to go there, Donny. All I want you to do is admit that if you look at just pedigree mutation rates, if you do longer generations, it slows down. And I put it to you that it slows down to a point where it eventually reaches the substitution rate, because now you're dealing with nearly neutral mutations finally, because selection has factored itself out.
But here's the thing. According to your model,
right, Donny, though?
Listen, no, I'm going to explain some basic things to you. According to your model,
go for it.
Okay, how long have humans been spread out, okay, all over the globe, existing in a large population?
Define humans.
Say that again, you drowned out.
I said define the word humans.
Homo sapiens.
Humans, do you mean Homo sapiens? Do you mean Homo, or do you mean
Homo
genus
sapiens.
Homo?
Homo sapiens.
Homo sapiens have been, and do you want to know how long the Homo sapiens have existed, or do you want me to, because I don't remember
how long
exactly
have we existed in a large, no, I'm saying how long have we existed in a large population, into the millions to billions?
Well, billions hasn't been that long. I think that they've been hundreds of thousands to millions for, well, like, you know what? I'd have to look it up. You want me to look it up? What the population of the world has been, or do you know? Are you asking me a rhetorical question, or do you need the answer?
Well,
if you ask me a rhetorical question, just tell me I don't remember.
If you go back 2,000 years to the time of Christ, the population was about 200 million. Okay, so rapid and exponential population growth was not until recent in human history, according to the evolutionary model. And so if you go back 100,000 to 200,000 years, how large of a population were humans existing in?
Hang on, let's see. Oh, sorry.
In the millions or thousands?
For when?
Going back, let's say 100,000
estimated
years.
4 to 6 million people as hunter-gatherers. And then we got to about 60 to 70 million by about 4000 BC, according to this one Google search that I'm doing. Is that I'm not going to commit to that because I don't know. I'd have to make sure that those numbers are correct. But let's say for the sake of argument that the world's population of humans was between 4 and 6 million in prehistory. Is that right? Is that the right number? I don't know. Is it good enough for argument? You tell me.
So if you took a needle, the time with it, if evolution's true, Homo sapiens go back about 200,000 years. Only at the tip of the needle do you have human history about 4,500 to 6,000 years. It's only relatively recent, according to the evolutionary timeline, that we actually have larger populations and larger populations that are spread out over the globe. So my next question to you is, fixation would be slower or faster in a population that has 7 billion people?
Much slower.
Right. What if we had a smaller population of, let's say, 10,000? Slower or faster?
It's faster.
Okay.
Population that you are talking about the trait. It's 4NE. Okay.
Right.
4NE generations is the quick and dirty estimate. There are other more complicated ways of doing it. We can get into those if you want to. There's like a Brownian way of doing it, but the quick and dirty way is it's about 4 times the effective population size.
Right. So according to the evolutionary
for the emergence of a new trait.
According to the evolutionary model and evolutionary history in terms of Homo sapiens. Okay. Has the human population existed in a smaller population for longer or a larger population for longer?
Smaller for longer.
A lot longer, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's only been since the agricultural revolution that that human population sizes have really taken off, right?
Exactly. So here's my next question. Fixation rates have been faster or slower when we consider the entirety of human history according to the evolutionary model?
Fixation rates have been faster during the period of time when there's smaller populations. So there's been more times smaller populations.
Right.
Which right up until the agricultural revolution. So that means fixation rate would have been faster during those periods of time. So, you're going to have more drift. You're going to have selection. This is really for drift, right? These numbers I'm giving you are for drift. So, like, what happens is that as populations increase, selection becomes the predominant force.
So here's my point.
Takes a backseat.
Here's my point, just not to drag this out any further, because we got to move on.
Well, I think
sooner than later. Okay, so my
all
point.
I wanted was for you to agree that as pedigree mutation rates increase in number of generations,
right? But you got some, right? But you got a lack of understanding.
Can we?
Listen, I've been very patient with you, Mr. I've been very patient with you. The beginnings of your sentences are constantly starting in the middle of mine. I'm going to finish my point because this is an important point that I think you're now just understanding. For only a small amount of human history, according to the evolutionary model, have fixation rates been slow because the population has been large. Okay, the invention of agriculture, as you put it, according to the evolutionary model, is why humans have been able to grow, okay, into the numbers that we have today. For most of human history, according to the evolutionary model, the human population has been small and fixation rates have been fast. And that's why there is a counterbalancing. There is an equilibrium point where, yes, fixation's slow today, but fixation was fast for most of human history, according to your model, which is why your pedigree rate, which is fast, equals the fixation rate, because the fixation rate was fast for most of human history. Okay? And so that's why, yes, both are relatively fast.
So when you say the pedigree mutation rate, you mean the pedigree mutation rate for how many generations?
The observed mutation rate.
For how many? The observed pedigree mutation rate for how many generations?
Well, you tell me. When Fatuma says that the neutral mutation rate.
Okay, so if you want to take the neutral mutation rate, I'm fine with that. The problem is when you take the pedigree mutation rate for one generation or for 3 generations.
Let's say
you take it for 14 generations or 20 generations, and you know what? It's going to approach the fixation rate, and then we're good. But your problem is that then it's too slow. You're not going to hit 6,000 years. You're way past it.
Because fixation rate's been fast. It's only slow.
Fixation rate's been fast compared to now.
Exactly.
Right? But the problem is like so first of all, you don't even need for the thing to fix in the entire human population in order to determine the differences between, two small groups, right? So if we're doing like the Canary Islands or Vanuatu or something like that, you don't need to worry about the fixation rate for all 7 billion people, right? But the thing is that I've lost my train of thought here.
No,
The thing
I
is
just wanna
that
ma- I
the
just wanna
pedigree
make this point.
mutation
So
rate is going to be is going to approach the substitution rate as we get to 20, 30, 40 generations.
but
And you can observe
that substitution rate would be fast because you have, according to the evolutionary model, a long time scale with faster rates of fixation because you have a smaller population. And so the last
what that
45
substitution rate's speed is going to put, where it's going to put mitochondrial Eve at that fast rate? About 1 to 200,000 years back.
No, that's based on the phylogenetic method. That's based on
the phylogenetic method is the fixation rate. That's the same. These are the same words. They mean the same thing.
I understand that they're used interchangeably and synonymous, but you're concerned with species-wide change. I'm concerned with how long does it take to accumulate these DNA differences from the Eve consensus sequence. And here's the thing.
We're both concerned with the same thing.
You admit it. Smaller populations are going to have faster rates of fixation. After the flood, you have humans existing as how many people after the flood?
Your effective population size is 5.
Right. So how fast?
5.
How fast is fixation going to be after the flood? With 5 people that are reproducing. Fast or slow?
It's going to be about 10. It's going to be about 20 generations to fix.
So according to the biblical creation model, we do have a solid 500 years there.
From the flood, 20 generations to fix a single allele, even starting with 5 people. 20 generations.
Right. So you're going to have mutate. So you have rapid
400 years.
And you're going to have a lot of mutations. And you're going to have a lot of mutations entering that population that doesn't spread out until the Tower of Babel. Then they take those different
How many people at the time of the Tower of Babel?
Probably about 100,000. Just
100,000. How many years between then and the Tower of Babel?
Probably about 300 to 500 years.
300 to 500 years, and they go to 100,000 people.
Somewhere, well, it depends how fast it could be between 10 and 100,000, but it's besides the point. It's majoring on the minors.
All right, no, these are going to be interesting things I'm going to throw in your face later. That's all.
Yeah, no, we can do a one-on-one. So, because we do got a lot to discuss here. So my point is, from the flood to the Tower of Babel, you have a lot of mutations entering. You also have a temporary time of faster fixation. So this makes it easy for the biblical creationists to explain those 25 differences that diverge from Eve. We're not concerned about species-wide change. That's what you're concerned about. For us, how long does it take on average to accumulate those differences? We can talk about the max, of course, but how long
may I jump in here?
The average.
That's okay.
Sorry, may I jump in here? You two have been going back and forth for like a half hour.
I'm gonna do this because I got some food ready. Me and Mr. Anderson feels like we went for quite a while there. 50
more than half hour. I want to be on the record. That was like 45 minutes.
Okay, I'm not. That was basically a debate. I'm not going to shut it down at 4 hours. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to eat some food. T-Rock, act as because I know T-Rock and Grayson want to have some impromptu debate. So I'm going to keep it going. But let's keep it cordial. Let's keep it respectful. Passionate's fine. Me and my boy and Mr. Anderson, we duke it out. We give the audience.
Donny, I got respect for you. I'm not going to try and give you the gears. But before you go,
I'll give you the last word.
One question, and it's a question I've asked you a number of times before. You will agree with me that as the pedigree rates increase in number of generations, the rate at which those differences, the rate at which those mutations accumulate in the end ancestor decreases significantly and approaches the fixation rate, right?
I will give you an answer to that on another, because I have to study it a little more, because I don't know how that applies to everything we've been talking about in terms of your neutral mutation. So when Fatuma says neutral mutation rate,
you know what? It's okay.
How do we know Fatuma when he says neutral mutation rate? You're saying he doesn't mean that as per 3 generations, a trios, grandmother, mother, daughter? That's not what he sees as a neutral mutation rate?
No, of course not.
So what does he see as the
unless all of the mutations that those 3 people accumulated were completely not selectable.
Right. I get what you're saying.
Like if by some miracle the only mutations that accumulated, then like and look, when Fatuma's talking about pop gen, right? So it's an average mutation rate. It's not taken based on like a 3,
what's the mutation
3-person pedigree, right?
What's the neutral mutation rate? What's the number?
I don't know. Who cares?
Okay, what do you mean?
It's whatever it is.
Isn't that the whole point? How long does it take to? Would you go with 0.1?
I don't know the number off the top of my head. The point is, whatever it is, it's different from the pedigree mutation rate. It's way slower. That's all I care about. If it matters to the, like, if my not knowing what the neutral mutation rate is means that you win this debate, you win.
No, I'm not trying to pose that as a gotcha question, because my understanding,
I don't know the answer.
Because from what I've seen, that they've done a study in the control region and they came up with a 0.5 mutation rate. Is that too fast for you? Is that too much for you? Do you think?
I don't know.
What's the fixation?
0.1. What's the substitution rate? Whatever that is. Go back and look at what they got out of the Vanuatu thing, or what they got out of the Canary Island thing, or what they got out of the the one where they measured it with the chimp, because the numbers are all pretty much the same. Whatever number that is, that's the one I think it is.
According to Fatuma's fixation equilibrium, if the neutral mutation rate, as per these couple of studies that I've mentioned, one based on the D loop, the control region, if it's, let's say, 0.5, does that mean that 0.5 or half a mutation is essentially becoming fixed per generation according to fixation equilibrium?
Okay. If the neutral mutation, what Fatuma is saying is that there are a certain number of mutations that are introduced to the genome by every single person in the population every generation, right? So every time there's a reproduction, there is a certain, like, for each person, there are a certain number of neutral mutations that have no selection, like that cannot be selected for at all, are introduced to the population, right? And crazily enough, if you go way, way, way back, right, for any generation, so like if the population size was 10,000, 40,000 years ago, 40,000 generations ago, like an equivalent number of mutations that are from way back then actually spread and finally eliminate all of their competition and become fixed in the population. And that by a crazy coincidence, the number of mutations that are introduced between one generation and the next is the same as the number of mutations that eliminate all of their competition throughout the entire population in a given generation. That's what Fatuma is saying. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. So I just want to, is it your position though? Just so I understand for our next discussion, we'll have to do a one-on-one so we can go longer. This was kind of a one-on-one, but you know what I mean, something pre-recorded. So the neutral mutation rate, when we see in these papers, let's say, that you calculated 0.1, 0.5. When Fatuma says neutral mutation rate equals the fixation rate, it's your position that he doesn't mean the 0.1 or the 0.5. That's not a neutral mutation rate to Fatuma.
No. What I'm saying is that whatever the number is, I don't know what the number is. I don't remember. It doesn't matter to me right now.
Just say it's 0.1 for sake of just say 0.1.
So if there are 0.1 neutral, let's say it's 5 or a round number. Let's say it's 2. Okay.
Okay. 2.
Let's say that for every person, every time a generation occurs, there are 2 neutral mutations that are introduced. Right.
Right.
At the same time, there are also 2 neutral mutations that have been in the population for generations and generations, which reach fixation. Now, those are not the same two.
I know.
They're completely different, but the number is the same. Okay. It's 2
on the
in both cases.
Exactly. So if the neutral mutation rate is, let's say, 5 per generation per person,
sure.
And that means, according to fixation equilibrium, 5 neutral mutations will become fixed every generation. It's not necessarily those 5, of course, that have been introduced, but 5 others that have been spreading through genetic drift, they become fixed.
Right.
Boom. So my point is, if the neutral mutation rate is 0.1 or 0.5 in the mitochondrial DNA, in light of fixation equilibrium, that's fast. That's too fast for evolution to account for if, and this is where we need to have a discussion, if those are nearly neutral, if they're slightly deleterious, because every time they become fixed, let's say those 5 become fixed, that's irreversible and irreparable damage species wide.
Yeah, you know what? You're gonna run into a buzzsaw on that one, but you know, we gotta let like Grayson talk here, or we're gonna go for another hour, because I would love to bust you on that one. But we should not do that right now.
I feel like we've now reached a point where we've established, okay, you get me, I get you. For our next talk, we need to go right into how that affects genetic entropy. Deal?
Sure. Yeah, I'm all for it.